Yeah. Wow. Pura vida, mi gente. Yeah, Wagwan. What's up to the people? Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate you guys being here, making the time to come learn with me. Yeah, so honestly, this is just a request. I saw a comment today. Hey, why don't you just do a video on Juan de Bolas and prove he's not, he's supposed to be African and all this. And I was like, all right, let me see. Random comment I got. I don't really know the person. Uh, but I just looked into it real quick. So, we're just gonna go ahead and talk about what the records, the primary sources say, right? Basically, and what they don't say. That's basically what we're gonna talk about. Because we got to show what's modern inferences and what's actually written in primary sources, and what's written at all. What is the context behind these stories, right? Most people have a basic understanding of what maroons are. Wow. Yeah. So we live. Yeah, shout out to everybody who's here. Make sure to check out all the previous research we've done, all the videos we've done. We got many playlists. If you go to my page, you go to the playlist tab, and you'll see many playlists here for you to dive into. A lot of videos, guys. We got like about 1,500 videos. All of them might not be in playlists, but most of them probably are. So if you go through all the playlists, like the Black Europeans, right? The real slave trade of America, very important to understand this concept today. Who was really participating, who were the slaves, all that, from Indigenous American to African American series, playlists. We got Untold Ancient American Truth. We got so much raw and different videos. All right, make sure to get all the playlists. Pura vida, mi gente. Pura vida. Yeah, Juan de Bolas, man. Juan de Bolas, man. Juan de Bolas, huh? Juan de Bolas, man. What does it say in the Calendar of State Papers, Colonial Series, America and West Indies, 1661 to 1668? All right, many editions, many volumes of this, okay? And these volumes are grouped by the years. So this is the years specifically. We go to about page, 68? All right, page 68, we zoom in. An act was presented to the Assembly of Barbados, recommending to the several ministers in the island the christening of Negro children and the instruction of adult Negroes, all right? Negroes does not mean automatically African. We're gonna discuss that again today, right? So it says in Virginia, an act was passed in 1667 that Negroes were not made free by baptism, 1585. In Jamaica, Juan Loyola, huh? Ebolas, Loyola, and Lubola, we're gonna see. And other Negroes, right? Doesn't say African, right? On account of their submission and services to the English, had plots of lands granted to them. And Lieutenant Governor Sir Charles Littleton, by proclamation, declared that they should, in consequence, enjoy all the liberties and privileges of Englishmen, but they must bring up their children to the English tongue. Loyola was appointed colonel of a black regiment of militia. So he was a colonel, not just a runaway slave, maroon, so-called maroon, but he was a captain when the English took over. This is the context we're going to read today. He actually was living in the time of Spanish control Jamaica, right? So-called Spanish, because it was controlled by the Catholics, but they allowed many people there, like Sephardic Jews and everybody else, and all the other undesirables they were getting rid of in the Spanish Empire, right? So he was helping the Spanish at first. And then when the English came in town 5 years later, he started helping the English. He, turned his back on he turned his back on the Catholics, of Spain. And he went with England, or the so-called English, who at this time were Cromwell and all his Protestant buddies, Huguenot buddies, Protestants. Yeah, now they're helping Loyola. Now he's a colonel. And he got his own so-called black regiment of militia and a magistrate over Negroes. Okay? Over what? Over Negroes. To decide all cases except those of life and death. So he decided that, huh? Loyola, huh? The Spanish resistance to the English occupation of Jamaica. So real quick, just to get. This is by Irene A. Wright, Transactions of the Royal Historical Society, Volume 13, 1930, page 117 and 147. You know, this is just a real quick, you know, we're just kind of diving in. And I'm just going to read a little bit, you know, just a little bit, go to the parts where they talk about Juan. It says the Spanish resistance to the English occupation of Jamaica, 1655 to 1660, by Irene A. Wright, B.A., FR historian, fellow of the Dutch Royal Historical Society, Utrecht. This was read 8 May 1930. The story of Cromwell's siege of Jamaica, May 1655, has been told in detail, drawn from English and from Spanish sources. All right, Cromwell's seizure of Jamaica from the so-called Spanish, from his enemies, the Catholic Spanish, who were allowing many of the conversos or crypto Jews to live in Jamaica as a haven. You guys remember we just recently went over these videos, right? We recently went over a lot of the videos on Jamaica and the Sephardic Jews, right? The hidden Jews, King's Heretics, how Jews built Spanish Jamaica, how Jamaica became a crypto-Jewish trading hub. That's from 2 weeks ago. Make sure to check it out if you haven't. All right, there's a whole history here that gets left out. And that's what I'm trying to inform you guys on. There's a whole context to have. It all fits into everything we're learning. You gotta, I'm trying to tell you, you gotta always apply what we've learned, and that's part of the main background story that's going on here. There's religious war, so-called religious, Catholics versus the cryptos, wherever form they went, wherever country they went. So the story of Cromwell's siege of Jamaica has been told in detail from the English and from Spanish sources. Far less has been written of the hard fighting by sea and land, which the invaders found necessary during the next 5 years because of the Spaniards' resistance to the English occupation. It is the purpose of this contribution to describe that resistance, especially from March 1656, when the Jamaicans took the offensive after receipt of some small relief from Cartagena de Indias, to May 1660, when Don Cristobal Jassi, look at this, Isasi Arnaldo, he was kind of in charge of the island in Spain on behalf of the Spain Catholics, and Juan de Bolas was under him first. Juan de Bolas worked for this guy first against the English when the English first came, because he was, you know, they was allowed to be, you know, had their maroon communities. But eventually Juan de Bolas, you know, kind of betrayed this guy, right? Cristobal Jassi Arnaldo, and there's a big reason, you know. He betrayed the Catholics. So he was the last Spanish governor of the island. He withdrew to Cuba, undone by the disaffection of the Negroes, so-called Negroes, who had been his chief support, see? Who had been his chief support. So this account is written from original documents, Spanish, existing in the General Archives of the Indies at Seville, Spain, of which transcripts are on file in the West India Reference Room of the Institute of Jamaica at Kingston. These have been compared with English sources to be found in the British Museum Reading Room and Manuscript Department. Okay? You're telling you, you know, this is all written down. What we're going to learn today, really, with ChatGPT is that there is no real, none of these primary sources, as you guys will see, say the word African. We're talking about so-called Negroes and rebels. So-called Negroes and rebels only, right? And we know Negroes could mean American indigenous people. It could be some of the Black Europeans, some of the Sephardic Jews that were there, you know, a lot of things, you know. So we got to dodge the hijack with that. So let's go to the part where it's talking about Juan de Bolas. Okay, let's see. It says here, This is, let's see, what page are we on? It's not get low. I want to make sure you guys know the page I'm on. Okay. So this would be, giving me the page. Oh, all right, 143. It says on February of 1660, found Yasi, right? That was the Spanish governor at the time. His territorial Sargento Mayor Don Juan de Tobar and the regulars encamped in the immediate vicinity of Las Chorreras. This is in Jamaica, right? Here on the 22nd of that month, the governor received alarming intelligence that Englishmen accompanied by Negroes of one of the 3 stockades which the former slaves of the island inhabited, or palenque, which they call every Indian stockade, they also call palenque, which happens to be the same thing they call where the slaves supposedly built palenques. Palenque, we know it's an ancient Maya city. That word is indigenous. Okay, so that's a whole other thing. That's a whole other video we got to break down about these so-called palenques. It's just like they're saying when the Indians had like a gated town, you know, like a fortified town. That's a palenque. It's the same thing, guys. So this is what they were saying about these so-called slaves who came from 3 stockades, right? They had attacked another of these palisaded settlements. Investigation confirmed this report. Colonel Tyson and Juan Lubolo, who was captain of Governor Juan Bolas to the English, all right? It's the same guy, Juan Bolas, had destroyed the stockade in question. About a month previous, this Negro and his following, discouraged by Yasi's inability to relieve their dearest necessities, had approached the enemy with proffers of peace so unexpected they seemed miraculous. These blacks, so-called blacks, gave hostages, admitted the English to their own stockade, and betrayed the location of others. In 4 years, the Oili had been unable to learn where these secret strongholds were, these palenques. And finally, Lubolo or Bolas, right, parentheses, led Colonel Tyson and his men against Yasi himself in a new camp to which the governor had at once removed on learning of the Negro's defection. So this is when he betrayed them, right? He betrayed the Spanish, and now he's with the English. So-called English, so-called Spanish, right? Because he's Spanish probably. He could be Spanish, he could be Indian. Despite his appreciation of the obvious and imminent danger which this defection constituted, Isasi's military precautions were inadequate, for in this new camp, Tyson and the Negroes surprised him on February 26. The Spanish loss was heavy. Don Juan de Tobar was among the killed. The enemy took a supply of casabi, which was all the food Isasi had. The governor and about 175 other persons survived, of whom perhaps 100 were effectives. Some saved their arms, and the English did not discover the cached munitions. So after this defeat, Tyson left letters for Isasi, apparently attached to trees on the scene of the route in which he offered the Spaniards quarter and transportation out of the island. Even before he received this proffer, Isasi himself was written to the English, asking terms so quickly had the desertion of his blacks reduced this man, the desertion of his so-called blacks, because this is very important to understand. Spanish lost control of Jamaica because of one man, because Juan de Bolas switched sides, because that was what was holding back the English. They had control of the island. You see, so-called maroons, right? Had control, real control of the island. So as soon as the tables turned, as soon as he went with the English, that's it. The Spanish Empire, Catholics had to leave. They lost. They couldn't hold. This guy Isasi was, the governor at the time. So the desertion of his so-called blacks reduced this man, with whom, despite Cromwell's urging and their own best efforts, the invaders had not hitherto been able to reach an understanding. Isasi reassembled his men and moved eastward, keeping close to the sea. He was within the region where he might hope to continue to receive the relief subsistence. All right, so let me see if there's another one. Yeah, let's see. Okay. So that's from here. That's basically the only mention in this article. And that was the only mention in this other book, right? None of them really say African or anything like that. So it's inference based on the fact that they want us to think Slave automatically means African, or Negro automatically means African, which that's not correct historically, especially in the primary sources. The terminology used by the Spanish and Portuguese at the time, things like that meant something else, which we've shown many records and primary sources to back up what we're saying, you know, and many scholars have written about it already. The so-called Spanish had control, but it was through the Sephardic Jews. The Sephardic Jews were the ones who helped the Catholics colonize the Americas. They wouldn't have been able to do it without the Sephardic Jews or Muslims, the Moors, you know, that fled the Inquisition. They had control of all the trade and ports and the ships, and they were the merchants, they were the navigators, you know. So they had to use them. And they sent a whole bunch to Jamaica. And that's what I was saying the other day. We did the video, so you guys can understand. Is this one right here? How Jamaica became a crypto Jewish trading hub 2 weeks ago. So you guys can check it out. And I mean, we got so many videos on this, right? But you know. So Juan de Bolas, man. Juan de Bolas, man. Lubolo or Luyola. As you guys saw in this one, this is a very old source, right? The quote and stuff, they call him Luyola. So Luyola, right? Luyola was appointed colonel of a black regiment of militia. So you know about the thing about Luyola, I know there's a Loyola. There's a Loyola surname in Spain. Loyola. During the Middle Ages, huh? Loyola, Loola, Loola, Lolita, Loya, Loyo. And there's Lobo. If we got Lobo, because they're trying to say Lobola, Lobo, right? Lobo is wolf. Lobo is wolf. And that's also a Spanish name. But, you know, that's inference. And that's what we're trying to show, that the African is way more inference. Because we've shown the background of real history of who the Sephardi Jews were, what Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, looked like, and his people, you know, these so-called Spaniards, like Conwells, you know, described the Swarty as well, like all these people, you know. So, was one of the first chiefs of the Jamaican Maroons, okay, Juan de Bolas. When the English captured Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655 invasion of Jamaica, the latter freed their slaves. You know, this is the Wikipedia version, guys. And look at the source. I'm gonna just show you. It's from Agorsa E. Kofi, Pan-African dude. I'm serious. He's like literally Pan-African, like admit it. He's from Ghana too. He's from Ghana, so he's the one that I kind of like they go to. He tried to like Africanize all the Maroons of Jamaica. Like this is, you know, he writes books like this, Africa and the African diaspora. You know, like it's very Afrocentric. That's all like I'm saying. You know, you just gotta understand what is a true primary source and what is modern inferences. Okay, that's what you guys gotta understand. So Juan de Bolas and his Maroon community was based primarily around the town of Luidas Valley. The Spanish attempted to retake the colony of Jamaica, and to this end, Don Cristobal de Isasi, there we go, relied on his alliance with the Spanish Maroons to secure this victory. But what happened? Juan switched sides, man. He switched sides, man. However, Governor Edward O'Daly succeeded in persuading one of the leaders of the Spanish Maroon, Juan de Bolas, to switch sides and join the English along with his Maroon warriors. Warriors, huh? Oh, warriors, huh? In 1660, when Isasi realized that the Bolas had joined the English, he admitted that the Spanish no longer had a chance of recapturing the island, since the Bolas and his men knew the mountainous interior better than the Spanish and the English, okay? You see that? Very important. They knew the mountains. Who would know the mountains more than the indigenous people of the land, right? So who are they really working with? Even if some of these are black Europeans, who are these majority of the more so-called Maroon warriors? Isasi gave up on his dreams and fled to Cuba. The English named 2 rivers and mountains after him to commemorate his assistance in expelling the Spaniards and bringing an end to Spanish Jamaica, as well as capturing hostile Maroons. The English appointed him colonel of a black militia, right? That's what we just read, right? And guaranteed his palenque. I told you, palenque, huh? Land and liberties forever. Palenque. His palenque. His own palenque. War with other Maroons, all right? Then it goes on, is, you know, okay. Just trying to show you a little history behind that, right? Just want to go ahead and Hold on a second. All right. So we go on to ChatGPT. All right, this is ChatGPT, chatgpt.com, so you guys can see. Just want to zoom in a little bit more. You guys can be able to read it. I said, Juan de Bolas, Jamaica, give me the truth that is recorded, no inferences, no conjectures, no Africanizing him, if no true sources that he was born in Africa or descendant of African mainland people. Show me the primary sources or the historians that can lead me to the primary sources so we can read them ourselves and interpret the info directly. And ChatGPT says, I'm going to stick strictly to what can actually be traced to primary documents or historians who work directly from them, and I'll clearly separate primary sources, right? 17th century records, later historians pointing to those documents, what those sources actually say and what they do not say. No conjecture, no assuming origins. The primary historical context, right? 1655, 1664, the person you're asking about is Juan de Bolas, active in Jamaica during the war between Spain and England, after England invaded the island and English invasion of Jamaica, 1655, all right? So that's what I'm saying. We got so-called English versus so-called Spanish, but it's deeper than that. Cromwell represented the Protestants. He represented the cryptos. He represented the Huguenots. He represented the Calvinists. And then he was fighting the Spanish Catholics, not the whole Spanish country, because many of the Sephardi Jews and Moors, right, were from Spain and Portugal. So I have context, okay? So primary records describing the events come mainly from Spanish archival correspondence stored in the Archivo General de Indias, Seville. These include letters and reports written by Cristobal Arnaldo de Isasi, last Spanish governor of Jamaica. Spanish officers, colonial officials in Cuba and Mexico. These documents were later studied and published by historians. One major scholarly study based directly on those documents is Irene A. Wright, The Spanish Resistance. Okay, that's the one I just read to you guys. This one right here. Okay? This one right here. Irene A. Wright. Okay? I told you, we go to the sources ourselves. She explicitly states that her work is based on original Spanish documents in the Archivo de Indias and English state papers, right? Those archives contain correspondence between Spanish officials and the Crown describing the resistance war in Jamaica. But the primary sources actually record about Juan de Bolas. From the surviving records and the historians who work directly from them, the following documented facts appear. He was a leader of a Maroon community. Records describe him as the chief of a community living in the Jamaican interior. His settlement was around Luida's Valley in central Jamaica. These communities were independent groups formed after people fled plantations or Spanish control into the mountains. He initially supported the Spanish, or Spanish control, that's very important. They fled what? Plantations or Spanish control. So it could include Sephardic Jews fleeing the Spanish Catholics, yeah. And Indians, right? Spanish control or the plantations as slaves, servants, runaways. He initially supported the Spanish. Spanish governor Cristobal de Isasi relied on these mountain fighters in his resistance war against the English occupation, okay? Spanish sources describe alliances with these groups during the campaigns against the English between 1655 and 1660. Around 1660, he switched sides. So 5 years when they first came, he was fighting with the Spanish, right? He was fighting with his governor. And then he switched up all of a sudden, right? Edward D. Oily negotiated with him. The English governor, Juan de Bolas, and his followers then joined the English forces. Spanish governor Isasi reportedly admitted that without Bolas' support, the Spanish could no longer hold the island. All right? He had to give up. The English rewarded him. English colonial records say he was made colonel of the Black Militia, granted land, okay? He was given land and recognition for his settlement, so-called maroon, huh? English place names were later given in his honor. Juan de Bolas River, Juan de Bolas Mountain. He died in 1664. Sources say he was killed in an ambush during fighting with other Maroon groups. So his own people or the other Maroons killed him? Damn. What the primary sources do not say This is important for your question. Oh, okay. All right. Let's get to the sauce, man. There's no surviving primary document that states he was born in Africa, states he was African born, states his parents came from mainland Africa, records of his birthplace. None of the known 17th century sources provide that information, okay? Very important. The sources only identify him as leader of a Maroon community, ally of the Spanish and later English forces. Where the African origin idea comes from, where does that come from? That comes from later interpretation, not primary documentation, okay? From later interpretation, inferences that all so-called black folks are from Africa, or that all slaves were Africans, or that, the word negro meant African. That's later interpretation, not primary documentation. Many modern histories assume the Maroon groups were formed from escaped slaves, mixed communities, indigenous people, and African descended people. Assume, right? But those are general interpretations of Maroon society, not proof about Juan de Bolas personally. Historians who discuss him and their sources, 3 historians cite the primary records, key scholars' work, Mavis Campbell, The Maroons of Jamaica, right? We got that book. I got that book too. Good thing I got reminded. We got E. Kofi, the Pan-African guy. We got C.V. Black, History of Jamaica. That's a modern book. And then N.O. Sainsbury. And that's what we just read. And the Calendar State Papers, which is this one. This is the older version. More trustworthy, more very, very scholarly, this is definitely in the archives of the Indies and the English archives. So then we go with the sources, right? So primary documents you can read yourself. If you want to examine the material directly, look at English colonial records, calendar. So we went to that. We read that already. Spanish archives. It says key documents, collection letters of Cristobal de Isasi, which Irene Wright quoted, okay? Because when you click on this and you open this page, it brings you to this, which is the Spanish resistance to the English occupation of Jamaica, right? That's what we just read by Irene Wright. You see? It's all the same sources, right? They're quoting her. And she didn't say Africans. And she's a little Modern Times, right? That's from Modern Times. And then bottom line, strict evidence from documented sources only, known Maroon leader in Jamaica, active 1655 to 1664, allied first with Spanish then English, helped the English defeat Spanish resistance, killed in 1664, unknown, birthplace, ethnicity, parents, okay? What is unknown? His birthplace, his ethnicity, his parents. They don't even know his parents, whether African born, whether he's indigenous, whether he's mixed. All right, so everything would be an inference, but we got to go with what is most likely. What I was trying to explain to the chat GPT is funny because it tries to resist, right? Those details do not appear in surviving primary records, right? I said, listen, so there's no primary sources proving he was from Africa. So why is he being called an African slave in modern times? Also, American Indians and Black Europeans were reclassified as Negroes too. So he could be from anywhere. But his name, Juan de Bolas, might tell us his origin. So I'm just saying, right? I'm trying to reason with the chat GPT, like, what's up? So you're really saying, after all that babbling, that you got no sources for him being from Africa, right? I've been here, man. I've been here. Welcome, welcome. So it says no primary source. So first of all, it says you're asking the right historical question. What do the sources actually say versus what later writers assume? Let's walk through it carefully. No primary source calls Juan de Bolas African, okay? All right? Period. From the 17th century records used by historians studying the English conquest of Jamaica, especially Cristobal Arnaldo de Isasi, letters to Spain. Basically, that's the most primary sources. That's the guy that he was working under first, right? That he betrayed. That guy never called him an African. Ever. In the 1600s, right? And then Edward D. Oley, the guy he went to work for when the English came, the so-called Protestants, right? He never called him an African either. So that's from English colonial reports. There is no surviving document that states he was born in Africa, he was an African slave, his parents were African. No, we don't even know if he was a slave. He could have been a prisoner of war. He could have been a convict. He could have been a Sephardic Jew, persecuted religion. Like he could have been many things. He could have been an Indian, right? Half Indian, many other things that are more historical and logical than inference based on the research we've done in the last 8 to 9 years. So the record simply, so none of them say he was an African slave or his parents were African, right? The records simply describe him as a leader of a maroon band in Jamaica. So yeah, that's the thing. Calling black Europeans a Moors, that's it's not always a Moor, right? All black Europeans are not Moors, but he could have been a Moor, a Muslim, crypto Muslim, yeah. But anyways, those documents are preserved in the Archivo General de Indias and in English colonial records later compiled in the Calendar of State Papers, Colonial American West Indies, which we read already. So it doesn't say anything about him being African. So strictly speaking, primary documentation does not give his birthplace or ancestry. So where's everybody getting this that he's African from then? Where the African slave label came from? The label comes from later historical interpretation, especially from the 19th and 20th centuries, okay? That's people adding the hijack later on. The primary sources don't say that. And that's what we do here. We research ourselves the primary sources. And the primary sources are telling us a whole different story. A major example is the historian Mavis Campbell, author of The Maroons of Jamaica, 1655 to 1796. Modern historians often assume Maroons were mostly escaped slaves of African origin because Juan de Bolas led a Maroon community. He gets retroactively categorized the same way, you see? You see what the ChatGPT is telling you? Once it knows the real history. But you can't say that to a historian because they'll be like, oh, no, that's pseudo. Oh, you're not a scholar. You don't got a PhD. I know more than you. So again, modern historians often assume Maroons were mostly escaped slaves of African origin. That's in general with any slave or any so-called black or Negro person, right? Or anything, or any person being called Negro historically in records. Which we know a lot of the Yo people, the American Indians in the United States, the same thing happened to them. So because he was a leader of a Maroon community, he gets retroactively categorized the same way as African origin, but where there's no proof. But that is an inference about the group, not a documented statement about him personally. What maroon originally meant in Spanish, okay? What did really maroon mean? This is a good point. Thanks for bringing that up, ChatGPT. The term itself comes from Spanish cimarrón, okay? Another thing I want to point out, maroon means brown, like another way of saying brown, guys, a shade of brown, maroon, cimarrón. But it originally meant wild or runaway and was used for runaway livestock, runaway slaves, independent people living outside colonial control. Say what? Independent people, so free people, not just a runaway. Wild, it meant wild, huh? Like an Indian, like how they were calling the wild savages, right? Wild Indians, huh? These wild Indians, we gotta get rid of these wild Indians. Maroons, huh? Runaways, huh? Runaway from what? That doesn't mean African. Do you understand? None of that automatically specifies ethnicity. It did not automatically specify ethnicity. You guys paying attention? So early Spanish reference to cimarrones in the Caribbean could include, as they say, they put in Africa, yeah, it can include Africans, North African, whoever was here from Africa doing their job, being an auxiliary, a soldier, conquistador, whatever, not just slave, but indigenous people, right? Cimarrones could be indigenous people, mixed communities, and occasionally Europeans, huh? It could be Europeans, right? They know, they know the records of a lot of these people who were so-called Maroons and what their heritage is, what their names are. The word describes status, not biological origin, okay? 4, colonial racial categories were extremely fluid. You're also correct that early colonial records used racial terms in ways very different from modern assumptions. Yes. Okay. Very different from modern assumptions. Colonial records use racial terms in ways very different from modern assumptions. All right. We're going note for note here to help you understand things. Terms like Negro, Moreno, Mulatto, Indio, and Pardo were often legal or social classifications, not strict biological categories. And all these terms applied to so-called black folks, so-called Negroes, so-called black folks, right? Mulatto, Indio, and Pardo were often legal social classifications, right? Historians studying Spanish America repeatedly note that classification could change depending on, now it can change all of a sudden on legal status, religion, location, political allegiance. It's all status. It's not about just the color of skin, but status. So someone could be labeled differently across documents. Very important, and we've shown the proof of this. We've shown many examples of this throughout the years. The name Juan de Bolas, his name actually gives an interesting clue. It is a fully Spanish style name, Juan, Spanish form of John de Bolas of Bolas. Names like this were commonly given to baptized indigenous people. Okay, well, he's saying maybe it was passed to him as the slave master passed it to him. Maybe not, but maybe so. Baptized slaves, converts, colonial soldiers, or auxiliaries too. These names were common with colonial soldiers and auxiliaries. So the name itself does not prove origin either. It simply indicates integration into Spanish colonial society at some point. One more thing often overlooked, the Spanish had ruled Jamaica for about 150 years before the English invasion. That means the island already had mixed communities, all right? Out of many, one people, right? So of course they're gonna still add ChatGPT is gonna still add Africans, right? That means the island already had indigenous people, African, Spaniard, mixed populations, runaway communities. By the 1650s, the interior group the English called maroons were likely very mixed. But again, that is reconstruction, not direct evidence about Juan de Bolas himself. The strict historical conclusion from primary documentation alone, he was known as Maroon leader in Jamaica during the English-Spanish War, originally allied with Spain, later allied with England, recognized as militia leader by the English. Just like any militia leader in North America, in the United States at the time. Not just as runaway slaves, this is what I'm trying to explain to you. A lot of context be missing. Unknown birthplace, unknown ancestry, unknown whether African, indigenous, or mixed. The surviving sources simply do not say. So I was like, yeah, just show me the Spanish descriptions, right? And I also wanted to ask it about the Africans. And I said, what? All right, so it goes over the things again. The same sources we already went over. So the Spanish description of the mountain fighters, they lived in mountainous and forests. Spanish correspondents described the fighters operating from the interior mountains and forests of Jamaica. They used the terrain so effectively that English troops could not control large areas of the island. This matches the geography of places like Cockpit County, the Blue Mountains, which are extremely rugged areas. They used guerrilla warfare, just like Indians did, huh? They used guerrilla warfare. Spanish and English reports describe them attacking settlements and disappearing back into the forest. Just like the Indians did, huh? The tactics included ambushing soldiers, burning plantations and houses, retreating into the mountains. These groups knew the terrain far better than either the Spanish or English armies, all right? The Spanish relied heavily on them. Isasi's letters repeatedly emphasized that his resistance against England depended on these fighters. Wright summarized it in this way: the governor relied on them whose support he preferred, upon whose valor he relied. In other words, the Spanish governor considered them his main fighting force. So once he lost that, the English won. So this is very important to understand. When they abandoned him, the Spanish lost. One of the most revealing points in the documents, when the leader Juan de Bolas switched sides and joined the English, the Spanish position collapsed. Isasi admitted that once Bolas changed sides, Spain could no longer hold Jamaica. That shows how important those interior fighters were. That's how important these people were, so-called maroons, to these empires. Multiple independent communities existed. Spanish and English records mention several groups of mountain fighters led by different chiefs. Two named leaders are Juan de Bolas and Juan de Serras. These groups operated from different mountain regions and sometimes fought each other. So the interior of Jamaica was not one unified group, but several independent communities. Evidence from mixed communities before the English arrived. Okay, so we already know they're gonna say again Spanish settlers, enslaved Africans, remaining indigenous Taino, and mixed communities. So let me get to my question because I was right here. It starts going up. The Spanish describes. So you can pause it. You guys can see what happened. Spanish colonists fled the island. So it's not. I'm not hiding anything. I'm just showing you because it's a long conversation. All right. I want to get my say in. So what the Spanish description actually show, putting the primary descriptions together, the fighters lived in mountain settlements, knew the island's interior terrain intimately, conducted guerrilla warfare, attacked plantations and English troops, sometimes fought each other, were crucial to Spain's resistance. Those are the actual recorded details, okay? So it says important point about the sources. The Spanish letters describe their military role and tactics, but they do not give detailed ethnic descriptions. They focus on loyalty, numbers, fighting ability, geography. They rarely record birthplace or ancestry, okay? Very importantly. Very importantly, this is what I'm saying. Oh, that's good, I read that. So it wants to keep, it says, I need to remind you of something first, right? I'm like, he's like, go ahead, I'm listening. What do you want to remind me of? You say they were a mixture of Indians, Europeans, and Africans. The Indians and Europeans we can definitely prove, right? But what Africans are you talking about existed in the 1650s Jamaica? Please show me the sources that list anyone in the maroon communities of the 1650s and not the 1700s, right? Because they try to give me sources from later on. Like, I'm not talking about that time period. We're talking about specifically Juan Bolas and who his community was, right? Because he's saying, ChatGPT is saying there's Africans, right? So that's what I'm questioning right now. So show me something from those time that they're being born in Africa or proven to be African descendants. What ships did they arrive on before the 1650s to Jamaica? And please don't send me on a wild goose chase about some archive I gotta go search through. Just give me the name of the source. Because see, they oh, go check this, it's probably this, and then they give me a Wikipedia page, right? Because your question is fair. And it's the kind historians should answer with actual name sources, not vague statements. I'll show you the specific sources that document Africans in Jamaica. Listen, he's going to show me, right? Then we'll look at whether any specific maroon individuals in the 1650s are documented as African born. I'm going to separate one, documented Africans in Jamaica before 1655, from two, documented maroon individuals with proven African birth, because those are two different questions. African documented in Jamaica before 1655 Spanish period. They are recorded Africans in Jamaica before the English conquest, right? So listen, I'm paying attention. I'm trying to see what it's going to give me, right? Source, early Spanish colonization. Commonly cited historical summaries. Listen to this. Listen to the source they're giving me. The commonly cited historical summary reports 1534 Spanish colonist Pedro Masuelo brought about 30 Africans, huh? Oh, okay. Okay, we're going to verify that. 1611, Census of Spanish Jamaica recorded 558 enslaved Africans, all right, and 107 free blacks on the island. Okay, so look at the sources giving me. You guys see this? I'm gonna click on it. I'm gonna show you something, right? I'm gonna click on it, open link, a new tab. All right, it's gonna open this. Let me go to full view. I'm gonna go to full view so you guys think I'm just making shit up. We're still in the ChatGPT. I'm gonna close this again. Just watch it open. Link, a new tab. This one open. The Jamaica Gleaner, right? What is this? Jamaica and the Atlantic Slave Trade, Part 2. Published by Arnold Bertram. When? In 2006. The first African slaves to be brought to Jamaica came in 15. This is the source. This is the source ChatGPT gave me. Do you understand how ridiculous this is to me, guys? Do you guys see how ridiculous this is? He gave me a modern website. When you go all the way down, this guy writing about Africans, he has no sources. He lists no sources. There's no sources here. I already showed you the only sources that exist. They list no sources. The first Africans, none of that. And then all that whole all this source that he gave me, that's from a modern website. Do you guys see? Are you guys watching? Like, what's up? I only see one person in the chat. What's up, everybody? How many people we got? 71 people. Are you guys paying attention? Do you understand what I'm showing you? Because I'm trying to tell you, people will go with this. Oh, look, he debunked Kurimeo. He debunk Kurimeo, ChatGPT debunk Kurimeo. With this page right here. With this guy's news story from 2006 with no sources. I'm showing you, look, he wrote this African. The fact of this campaign is self-confident of Africans, people of African descent, continue to this day. 3 centuries later, we seize upon a routine. What Africans? Oh, you guys are listening? Thank you. Thanks for letting me know, because I'm trying to know, trying to see if you guys are paying attention or what. Okay. So no source for that. That cancels out. Bang. So you don't have nothing. That's one. And then he says the source Spanish imperial slave trade policy, right? Again, giving me a modern website. I'm just listen, guys. This is from the JamaicaTimeline.com. The settlement of Africans in Jamaica, right? Okay, again, go all the way down. Look at disembark. They're getting this from slave voyages that has no sources. We already know that's a gimmick. That website is pseudo. Numbers on the screen with no sources. All right, look what they're using. So check it out. This is a modern website. What other sources do they have? Where's the primary sources for what you're saying? Where's all the ships? Where's all the ships? You guys learning? Okay, you see? I'm just showing you, right? This is the sources it threw at me. 2 sources. Because I already know what slave policy they're talking about. They're talking about Charles V granting that Negroes be enslaved. Negroes. He never said Africans. And one of the places they grabbed these Negroes from was Cape Verde, not even the mainland Africa. That's a whole other thing right there. So it says here, population estimate around the English conquest. 1,400 Africans, right? Look, that's from Old Jamaica Gleaner. Again, that's from the Pan-African news writer, Jamaica Gleaner again. All right. Where's his numbers coming from? What Africans? Do we have named African Maroon communities of the 1650s? This is where things change. For the specific Maroon leaders of the 1650s, the documentation is extremely thin. Known leaders include Juan de Bolas, Juan de Ceros. The sources describing them say the Maroon communities likely included escaped African slaves. Likely, right? This is Wikipedia he's quoting. Look, let me open it up. Wikipedia. Talking about Africans, right? Which they got from Kofi, the Pan-African guy. Kofi. Okay. See how we debunked all this, right? So accounts say that when the English invaded 1655, the Spanish freed their slaves and those people fled into the mountains and formed independent communities. So that doesn't mean African. But the sources do not give ship manifests. African birthplaces. Or individual biographies for the Maroons of the 1650s. Ships bringing Africans to Jamaica. It says large-scale slave trade in Jamaica did not start until the British period. Body bag for the illusion. Yo, shout out to Drop, man. So wait, hold up. So what Africans were there then? If the English aren't even in control yet. You guys see what I'm saying? Large-scale slave trade to Jamaica did not start until the British period. So what Africans did the Spanish have that were there before the English? For 150 years, right? 150 years they had control of Jamaica. They're telling you straight up that there was no large-scale slave trade. Yeah, you don't have no sources. I already knew that. I'm just being smart. I know that you got no sources. So after Britain took the island in 1655, the transatlantic trade expanded dramatically, eventually bringing hundreds of thousands of Africans. Yeah, right. Look at the source. Jamaica Timeline. Again. This is not a source, guys. This is a website. I showed you real sources. Okay? These are not sources. So under Spain, the population was small and the number enslaved. I'm gonna get to it. I said, listen, first of all, the source you gave me, right? I was talking about the 1534 and all these Africans coming to Jamaica from that newspaper website. This is what I said. I said, this is from a third-party modern website, which has no footnotes or sources to back up its interpretations. That is not a primary source. I asked you not to use third-party website with no sources to prove their statements. Do the actual sources they are supposedly citing actually say Africans or slaves or Negroes instead? Come on, do better. No, wait till I'm done reading your whole response, because I wanted to respond to several things, but he didn't wait. Anyways, the 1611 census of Spanish Jamaica The document historians reference is the 1611 census ordered by the Spanish crown. The census is preserved in the Spanish Imperial Archive, Archivo General de Indias. Historians studying Spanish Jamaica cite this census as listing the populations category used by the Spanish administration. One historian who discusses this census is Francisco Morales Padrón in his book Jamaica Española. Look, now listen to what the census says. All right, that's it. Anything else is inference. So it says the census categories recorded include terms such as Españoles or Spaniards, Indians, Negroes, esclavos or enslaved Negroes, or Negros libres or free Negroes, free Negro, free black, free colored, right? Same thing. Where does it say African? Where does it say African in this original source from 1611? Right? See, no, most people don't go into the research like this, guys. You guys got to understand the whole African thing came much later. It's all inferences. I've been trying to tell you and show you this for years. Important point. The document, right, uses the word Negro, not African. Spanish colonial records almost always use Negro as a legal social category. They rarely listed continent of birth. So if a historian later, right, later writes Africans, they are usually interpreting the category Negro. You see? They just switching the word Negro to African, and we know Negro does not automatically mean African when American Indians were being called Negroes, and Black Europeans were as well. The Spanish period slave import policy, the permission for African slaves importation in 1511 comes from a royal decree issued by Charles I of Spain, right? Permission for African slaves, huh? Importation, huh? Did Charles I really say Africans? Watch me get him with that too. Watch. See, I know how to mess with this guy, this robot. The decree allowed merchants to ship enslaved people from West Africa. Oh, from West Africa, okay. So the decree is discussing the Atlantic slave trade census. However, the decree applied to Spanish America broadly, not specifically to Jamaica. So that doesn't even apply to this story. But we're going to talk about that anyways. So it shows legal authorization, not proof of who specifically arrived in Jamaica. Right, so early Spanish Jamaica population studies. A historian studied the Spanish Jamaican population from archival records of Francisco Morales Padrón, which they quoted earlier. And, you know, he quoted the census and none of it said African. Another historian used an archival Spanish document, Cheryl Elizabeth Ward. They described the small populations of Spanish Jamaica and note the presence of enslaved people categorized as Negroes in administrative records. Again, the documents use a specific legal term, not the word African. All right. Hey, Alonso, much love, brother. Thank you for that. Thank you for the love, man. Peace, peace. You know, we take it one day at a time, you know, just trying to stay productive always, you know, still healing, still going, you know. Hope you're doing good, man. So it says Spanish military reports during the 1655 invasion. When England invaded Jamaica and the English invasion of Jamaica, Spanish Governor Cristobal Arnaldo de Isasi wrote letters describing the resistance forces. These letters are analyzed in the Spanish resistance to the English occupation of Jamaica, which we already read today, guys. This one right here, right? We already read today. It doesn't say nothing about him being from Africa either. All right? We read it already. We read the other one, Calendar State Papers Colonial Series, if you just got here, guys. And I just want to show you, I got another one. Hold on. Okay, and this is, hold on, let me show you guys what book this is right here. All right, I got all these books. These books are all going to be in my PDF. I'm sorry, a PDF version in my Patreon, right? So the Maroons of Jamaica, 1655-1796, by Mavis C. Campbell, right? They quoted her a couple times. She kind of tries to Africanize them based on the word Negro. So that's what the ChatGPT was saying earlier, right? It says from fragmentary, hold on, let me zoom in. From fragmentary data, it would seem that at least 3 main Black groups with recognized leaders were later formed out of the early uncertainty and confusion, so-called Black. The best known of these groups settled in the hills above Guanaboa Valley under the leadership of Juan de Bolas, who was given his name to this place to this day. It is possible that the members of this group consisted of some free blacks, and the others may have been largely agricultural slaves. So, what? Free blacks, huh? I told you guys. Who's these so-called free blacks? This is what I'm trying to tell you guys. That's a whole other context missing. You're saying these could be Indians, right? Local people who's always been free, never slaves. So it's not about just runaway slaves, right? Or it could be Sephardic Jews who were free. They were free. Remember, they got there as long as they were doing business, conducting, making the island prosperous. They were allowed to pretend to be Christians and practice their thing in secret, right? A lot of things. It could be a lot of things here. So some free blacks and others may have been largely agricultural slaves, huh? Servants, agricultural servant, indentured, and comenderos, yeah, indentured servants. The second group, much less known to history, was established at Los Bermejales, an area which more isolated, more secluded than the first group. Okay, so that's a little bit on Juan right here. And then Juan de Serras, let's see what we got. Okay. So it says here, this was the Palenque or Pelinco of British designation of Negroes, about 150 under the bulo, which are lanciers and archers, and many of the private men of war. Exactly what is meant by private men of war is not clear, but this is probably the first British official report on Juan de Bola, right? Men of war, huh? Warriors, huh? Variously called Juan de Bola, de Bolas, Lubola by the British, but called Juan Lubolo. Possibly, look, she doesn't know. She's a modern. This book is very modern, guys. Possibly an African name without the Juan, and may well have been an Angolan. May have been, possibly, most likely, maybe. I don't know. I'm just guessing. Possibly, maybe, may have, will be. This is how later historians, this is what ChatGPT was saying. Later historians trying to make these people Africans. Okay, so we got all the sources here. I just want to show you. Again, just so you think I'm not just making this up. All right, hold up. This is not a primary source. And as she admitted, maybe she's guessing. As she admitted, and that's the correct thing for her to do. All right, that's the correct thing for her to do, because she doesn't know. She's making that up based on inference that slaves and all black folks are from Africa. So this is what year? Come on, give me 1990, right? This is very modern. This is from 1990, okay? Just wanted to show you that. Let's go back real quick. So the Spanish resistance to English occupation, we read that. The document mentions cimarrones, runaway maroons, but they do not list detailed ethnic origins. They focus on military alliances and geography. Number 5, important correction about maroon communities. Your question was very specific. Do sources list maroons in the 1650s as African-born individuals? From surviving documents, no specific maroon individual in the 1650s is recorded with a birthplace in Africa. Okay? The record names leaders like Juan de Bolas, Juan de Serras. I hope you guys watch from the beginning so you guys see everything we've already debunked if you just got here. Okay? So far it's telling me, you guys see this, there's no what Africans, right? So second point, I said the source you provided, source Spanish imperial slave trade, right? That supposedly brought African slaves. I showed it the original. I want to show you guys. I hope you guys can see this. This is the original decree by Charles I, allowing slaves to be taken to the Spanish colonies, and it actually says Negroes. It doesn't say Africans. Okay? And it specifically states Cape Verde on it. Right? This is where they're getting a lot of their Negroes. Right? So they said in 1518, Fernando Isabel's grandson, Emperor Charles V, abolished the provision requiring slaves to be born in the Christian domain and issued a charter allowing 4,000, I slash Africans because we know they were really enslaving Indians and the Sephardic Jews and all these people. That was who they were going after, to be purchased directly from Portuguese traders in the Cape Verde Islands. And that's who's in the Cape Verde. That's the real history. And transported to the New World. The first slave, okay, so when I gave that to ChatGPT, look, I'm not kidding. I said, hey, It's also from a modern website with no, the source it gave me, right, that news, it was also another website. It wasn't a real primary source. And the degree you're talking about said Negroes, not Africans. And I gave him the decree. And ChatGPT can actually translate that, which looks Arabic, but it's Spanish. That's how the Spanish wrote it that time. They wrote looking like it's Arabic. Did you guys notice that? Why? Look at it. What are we really talking about? Look at it. It looks almost like a little bit like Arabic, cursive, right? That's actually Spanish or Latin, right? So I said, the decree you're talking about said Negroes, not Africans, and they explicitly said Cape Verde as the source of these Negroes in the original records, as the attachments show. And it says, you're absolutely right to show this down and go back to the wording of the document themselves. That's exactly how historical source criticism is supposed to work. Let's address the two issues you raised. The 1518 decree, what it actually says, all right? What it actually says. The decree issued by Charles V in 1518 is well known in Atlantic history because it granted a license or an asiento to transport enslaved people to the Spanish Americas. Remember, this was a legal thing. You couldn't just enslave anybody, right? In the original Spanish wording, the document generally uses the term like Negroes or esclavos negros. They do not usually say Africans. That decree does not say Africans. That distinction matters because Negro in Spanish colonial documents was primarily a legal administrative category. It didn't reflect origin, right? It could refer to enslaved people of African origin, but the document itself usually does not state birthplace. It could be so-called Africans, but who would the Spanish and Portuguese really enslave? And when we really look at the sources, the screenshot is consistent with what historians know. The license allowed 4,000 Negroes. Look, it translated it to be purchased through Portuguese traders. Who was the Portuguese? Come on, guys. Come on, man. So I'm gonna remind it of this, right? So Portuguese, look, Negros de Terra, right? What does Negros de Terra mean? Oh, Negros de Terra, right? Okay, so this is Negros de Terra, right? Hold up. We got the book, actually. Blacks of the Land, right? So Blacks of the Land, Indian Slavery, and Settler Society. So Negros de Terra, this is the English translation. This is the book we read. Blacks of the Land, or in the original writing is Negros de Terra, right? Negros de Terra. Negros de Terra. Let's see if we can find it. Negros de Terra PDF. There we go. All right, this is the original. Okay, Negros de Terra, right? Negros de Terra by John Manuel Montero. And this is the English version, which we have read. John M. Montero, right? This is translated only, but it's the exact same book we've read. And they were calling American Indians Negroes of the Land, or Negros de Terra, or Blacks of the Land. Blacks of the Land. So when we're talking about that the license allowed 4,000 Negroes to be purchased through Portuguese traders connected to the Cape Verde trade system, that reflects the Portuguese Atlantic slave network operating through Cape Verde. Now check this out, because we got like a lot of videos on this. I think it's in here, right? The real slave trade. Let me see. I kind of recently re-uploaded it. I re-uploaded this video right here. All right, let me just show you the cover. This video, they don't let me monetize it. Both times I try to upload it. So primary source, American Indigenous slaves, right? Or Negroes of the Land, right? Negroes of the Land. Okay. First of all, let's get this dropped like it's the first time.
Free people of color, or so-called Negro, right? Or so-called Black now, or so-called African American today, all right? but you know, we know better now. I also want to remind you guys, today we're going to talk about the pearls divers and what they were doing to these pearl divers, the cruelty, you know, of these crypto Sephardic Morisco people that were coming down as conquistadors, right? Conquistadors and explorers, right? And doing this on behalf of the Catholics, right? And remember that the Aboriginal people of the Bahamas, the Lucayans, were a dark-skinned race. Columbus and primary sources from Columbus himself describes them as dark complexion, as you see here, just like the Canary Islanders. Dark complexion. Again, the Lucayans, dark-skinned race, right? The Lucayans, dark-skinned race. And what happened to the Lucayans again? This is from my video, Pearls in the American Aborigines. Check it out. I did drop this yesterday. The Lucayans, 40,000 of them, right? 40,000 of them, associate number, right? The Lucayans to the number of 40,000 to slave in the mines and on the plantations of Hispaniola. Now, when those got filled up, we know they eventually ended up in Margarita Island, Venezuela, because these are very expert pearl divers. We got the whole history. So these were the actual so-called slaves that were bringing in to replace the population of Hispaniola, supposedly, right? It was supposed to be Africans that they were replenishing it with, and it wasn't like that. It was actually other indigenous populations, mostly. And then the other ones we know were coming from Europe. Yeah, the Ladinos, the unwanted, the Sephardi, yeah, the prisoners of war, all that, indentured servants, yeah. All right. So again,
So right away, they're enslaving dark complexion, so-called black Lucayans, right? 40,000 of them alone. And you're saying that the Charles V decree, Charles I, right? He's only asking for 4,000. When they got hundreds of thousands of so-called black Indians or Negroes de Terra or blacks of the land, Negroes de Terra, blacks of the land available, hundreds of thousands of them. So when we're talking about the screenshot I'm showing, right, from the actual written record of Charles I says 4,000 Negroes, right, to be purchased through Portuguese. Portuguese were heavily enslaving the Indians. The Portuguese were heavily enslaving. Originally published in Portuguese for 1994 as Negros de Terra, this field-defining work by the late historian John Monteiro has been translated into English by Professor Barbara Weinstein and James Woodward. Monteiro's work established ethnohistory of a field in colonial Brazilian studies and made indigenous history a vital part of how scholars understand Brazil's colonial past. Drawing on over 24 collections on both sides of the Atlantic, Monteiro rescued Indians from invisibility, documenting their role as both objects and actors in Brazil's colonial past, and most importantly, providing the first history of Indian slavery in Brazil. Monteiro demonstrates how Indian enslavement, not exploration or the search for mineral wealth, was the driving force behind expansion out of Sao Paulo and through the South American backcountry. Okay? This book makes a groundbreaking contribution not only to Latin American history, but to the history of indigenous slavery in the Americas in general. Okay, so this is what I'm saying, guys. 4,000 Negroes, and I think I'm going to show it in this video. I wasn't done. Let me see. Where were we? Okay. So I think we started talking about it. Let me see. 4,000. Carib Indians as slaves over here. Margarita Island. Caribbean on the coast should be reduced to bondage. So in 1535, the king again decreed that the Caribs should be reduced to bondage. They were to be considered as slaves, used as such and marked, you see? All over the place, guys. All over the place. Let me just get to a point here. Captain Pedro Caliz, Harley had the Indian pearl fishermen issued from the water with supply of oysters when their masters forced them. All right, when they were using them for pearl diving. We got a whole video on that. Okay. Remember, they're using a lot of the Lucayans they had taken. Used a lot of the Lucayans. So we're going to talk about, okay, this guy right here. Benozoni, who was a whitewashed Muslim crypto. He was a crypto Muslim. Giovanni Battista Belzoni. He enslaved a lot of the Indians. All right, let's just get this right.
source. Now we're going to get another primary source, Benozoni.
And with the book, which is called Spanish and Portuguese South America during the colonial period. by Robert Grant Watson. It says editor of Maury's Handbook of Greece, 4th edition, and also author of a book called The History of Persia. So he's very popular and with these historical books, right? A scholarly source. The Italian traveler Benozoni, who had been referred to in the preceding pages, has been quoted by Robertson, Irvin, and Helps, but considering the unique position which he holds as being the first foreign critic of the proceedings of the Spaniards in South America, I scarcely think that his volume has received the full attention which it deserves at the hands of modern writers on Spanish South America. I would therefore draw attention to some extracts from his work, begging the reader to bear in mind that they proceed by no means from a man of the mold of Las Casas, but from one who, by his own confession, took part in a slave hunting expedition. All right, so they're saying, all right, we're going to read this account from this person. He ain't no angel like Las Casas. That's what they're saying. He actually was a slaver. All right, it says the author in question was nevertheless, as he states, a devout Christian. So even though he was enslaving American Indians, because that's what we're talking about here, not Africans, the author in question, it says, was nevertheless a devout Christian. And he dedicates his history of the New World to Pope Pius the Fourth. All right, so it says Benozoni, all right, remember the slaver, started for America in the year 1541, and there spent 14 years of toil and travail, landing at the Gulf of Paria. All right, this is in South America, I believe close to Venezuela, or in Venezuela today. He proceeded to Cuba and other islands, returning thence to Acla, when he crossed to Panama, from which place he visited the kingdom of Peru. The kingdom of Peru. In this wandering course he passed 14 years. Benozoni is the author who is originally responsible for the well-known story of Columbus and the egg. He states that whilst at Amaracapana, all right, let me take that off so you can see that. Amaracapana. All right, so let's zoom in a little bit. It's a little better, right? I want you guys to see this. So Amaracapana. So while he was at Amaracapana, this is in South America, it says, he states that whilst at Amaracapana, Captain Callis arrived with upwards of 4,000 slaves, 4,000 slaves, and had captured many more. When some of them could not walk, the Spaniards, to prevent their remaining behind to make war, killed them by burying their swords in their sides of their breast. So when they couldn't survive these slaves they had, they would just kill them so they wouldn't, make delays or stay behind or anything like that. All right. It was really a most distressing thing to see the way in which these wretched creatures, naked, tired, and lame, were treated, exhausted with hunger, sick and despairing. The unfortunate mothers, with 2 and 3 children on their shoulders or clinging around their necks, overwhelmed with tears and grief, all tied with cords or with iron chains around their necks, or their arms or their hands. Nor was there a girl but had been violated by the depredators. Oh man, they were even violating the girls. At page 159, Benozoni observes that Spaniards have eulogized themselves too much when they tell us that they are worthy of great praise for having converted to Christianity the tribes and nations that they subjugated. All right, so we're talking about these tribes and nations. All right, for there is great difference between the name and the being one in reality. All right, so even though they were bolstering themselves, talking about we were evangelizing them and making them civilized and Christian, all right, they were covering that, the cruelties, atrocities that they were committing. All right, with that, it says the slaves, all right, this is quotes, somebody saying this, all right, it says the slaves are all marked in the face and on the arms by a hot iron with the mark of C. Then the governors and captains do as they like with them. Some are given to the soldiers, so that the Spaniards afterwards sell them or gamble them away amongst each other. When ships arrive from Spain, they barter these Indians for wine. Who? The Indians. All right, so let's go back. All right, I want you to understand what's going on here. All right, because it says that Benozoni, right? Remember, he arrived at Where? At Amaracapana. There was already a place called Amaracapana in South America. All right. He arrived with what? With 4,000 slaves, it says, right? Now we go back. Who were these slaves? These were Indians, right? So when ships would arrive there, what they would do from Spain, they would barter these Indians for wine, flour, biscuit, and other requisite things. And even when some of the Indian women are pregnant by the same Spaniards, they sell them without any conscience. Then the merchants carry them elsewhere. They carry them elsewhere. They take them to the other side, reverse, and sell them again, and sell them again. Others are sent to the island of Hispaniola. All right, so once they leave their mainland, their indigenous land, and they travel to these other places, right, these servants and slaves that they capture, these indigenous people, they put in captivity, prisoners of war, they would call them Negroes from there. You understand? Filling with them some large vessels built like caravels, all right, filling the vessels, right? Filling with what? With Indians, not Africans, Indians, and supplying what? Hispaniola. Because why? They had already decimated most of the population of Hispaniola through the same kind of slavery, sending them elsewhere with their diseases. A lot of suicides, a lot of cruelties was going on, so the population would decrease fast. They were, you know, I mean, we're not saying you went extinct, of course not. But they had to replenish the slave population. All right, and they did it with other indigenous people. All right, so it says they carried them under the deck, and being nearly all people captured inland, they suffered severely the sea horrors. And not being allowed to move out of those sinks, what with their sickness and their other ones, they have to stand in the filth like animals. And the sea often being calm, water and other provisions failed them, so that the poor wretches, oppressed by the heat, the stench, the thirst, and the crowding, miserably expired there below. All right, we're talking about American Indians that are experiencing this cruelty. All right, we're talking about Deuteronomy 28, and you know this is untold truth.
Yeah. So that's the old clip. I hope you guys paid attention. So how many Indians did they have? Did they enslave? 4,000 in this example, just in this alone. 4,000 Indians, huh? 4,000 Indians, just like it says that in the screenshot, Charles V, same person, right? Charles V said, what did ChatGPT translate? That there was a license to allow 4,000 Negroes, right? Negroes can mean Indians, right? Negroes, the terror, blacks of the land. And we just saw the video that they were enslaving 4,000 Indians, right? The Lucayans, 40,000 of them alone, right? You guys following me? So when they're saying, oh, they could have been Africans before 1655 in Jamaica, history tells us most likely it was American Indians and they're undesirables of Europe. That is what is recorded in primary sources. You guys understand what I'm showing you? I'm covering everything. Like you can't say, oh, but they could have been some. What's some? Show me. That's what I asked ChatGPT to show me, and it gave me these bogus sources that I just broke down for you. So that reflects the Portuguese Atlantic slave network. So he's still going with the whole West Africa, Cape Verde, South Tome. But again, the document itself uses Negro, not Africans, and it doesn't say it went to San Tome or West African coast. So your correction is accurate regarding terminology in the primary record. Cape Verde in the 1500s, and it's again, it's gonna say it includes African mainland people and all this other stuff. And well, if you know the history of Cape Verde and you see who was really going there back and forth in the records, you'll start seeing a trend of who it was more of. Does the decree mention Jamaica? This is not another key point. The 1518 license did not specify name Jamaica. It authorized slave shipments to Spanish America colonies, generally, especially places like Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Hispaniola, just like the Indians that we just read about. The Charles V order to be taken there, right? And branded with the letter C, with his name on it, right? Jamaica was a smaller Spanish colony during this period, so the decree proves legal authorization for the trade, but it does not itself prove shipments to Jamaica. So even that gets canceled out anyways. But we had to make a point about it. Because a lot of people try to use that. Oh no, Charles V said you can enslave 4,000 Africans. It never said nothing like that. And we got hundreds and thousands of American Indians being enslaved and being called Negroes. Because that's what the document said. It said enslaved Negroes for the Spanish colony. So why historians say Africans were in Jamaica? Most historians infer African presence from later Spanish administrative records, which list categories such as Negros, Esclavos, or Negros Libres. That is where the whole inference is coming from. Documents say Negroes, guys. You know, enslaved Negroes or free Negroes. That's what it says. It doesn't say Africans. But again, those documents do not usually record birthplace. So if a modern historian writes Africans, they are usually interpreting the category Negro based on broader Atlantic trade patterns. Your critique is valid. That interpretation should not be confused with explicit wording in the primary document. Okay? 5, your key question about the Maroons of 1650s. Your original challenge was very specific. Show sources listing Maroon individuals in the 1650s born in Africa. So now Juan de Bolas records that describe them as cimarrones, runaways, leaders of mountains communities, but they do not record continental origin. So your methodological point, and it's a strong one, you're applying a standard that historians call source criticism, meaning distinguish what the document actually says from what later historians infer. In this case, primary documents say Negros, cimarrones, and esclavos. They usually do not say African. And he keeps saying usually, they don't say African at all. So far, I've shown you that, right? So if someone claims a specific individual was African born, the historian would need a document stating Natural de Guinea, or even Cape Verde, or another birthplace. For Juan de Bolas and the early Maroons, that kind of document has not been found so far. Zero. All right, I hope you're hearing me. Hope you're still awoke. You haven't fallen asleep, right? I know it's late for some of you. So basically, let's just say it how it is without sugarcoating or trying to explain away that there is no proof of actual born Africans documented in Jamaica before 1655. Let's just not overlook the evidence, and let's say with certainty that we can prove Indian slaves and undesirable Europeans as possible runaways too. So he's like, I get what you're doing here. You're trying to separate what is provable from what later historians assume. And that's a good historical method, right? Let's state the situation plainly and carefully, sticking to what the evidence cannot demonstrate. But what they document, right, is under Spanish rule, the surviving records show the presence of several categories of people. Indigenous people. Spanish colonial documents repeatedly mention Indios in Jamaica. These were the remaining Taino or indigenous Caribbean people who survived the early conquest period and sometimes lived outside Spanish settlement. Europeans, the island had a small Spanish settler population. Some were colonists, soldiers, administrators, convicts, or marginalized settlers, or even slaves, man. They're leaving that out. Runaways from colonial society did occur in Spanish territories generally. So even Europeans were running away. It's basically what ChatGPT is explaining. Enslaved people categorized as Negroes. Spanish administrative documents do include categories like Negros Esclavos, enslaved Negroes, and Negros Libres, or free Negroes, but the record rarely lists birthplace. They typically record legal status rather than origin. So those documents do not normally state born in Africa, okay? How many more ways can we say this, man? Maroon communities in the 1650s, the people living in the mountains who resisted the English after the English invasion of Jamaica, are described in Spanish and English records as cimarrones, runaways, maroons. Known leaders, Juan de Bolas, Juan de Serras. The documents describe their settlements in the mountains, their alliance and conflicts, their military activity, but they do not record their ancestry or birthplace. Once again, what historians can say with certainty, based strictly on surviving documents. Indigenous people existed in Jamaica, of course they did, during the Spanish period. Spanish settlers and other Europeans were present. People categorized as Negroes existed in the colony, enslaved or free. Runaway communities, cimarrones, existed in the mountains by the 1650s, okay? What cannot be proven from existing records, the surviving documents do not provide birthplace for Maroon leaders like Juan de Bolas. Ship manifests tying specific individuals in Jamaica to African ports before 1655 explicit statements that those specific Maroon leaders were African born, okay? So claims about the exact origin of particular individuals are usually interpretations, not direct documentary proof. The careful historical conclusion, the evidence allows historians to say the population of Spanish Jamaica included indigenous people, Europeans, and people categorized as Negroes. Maroon communities formed from people who left colonial control. But the precise ancestry of specific Maroon leaders in the 1650s is not documented in surviving records, okay? I said here, but point number 5, you need to emphasize that indigenous people and Europeans were also classified as Negroes. So including that term like it's separate from them could be an error. When many were proven to be reclassified as Negroes too, no inference is recorded. Paper genocide happened, so let's conclude again. Hey, come again, man. Come again, ChatGPT. What the sources say for Jamaica before 1655 actually show. During Spanish rule, right, the records from the colonial administration use several legal categories: Indios, indigenous people; Españoles, Spaniards; Negroes, a legal category used in colonial records; Esclavos, enslaved people; Cimarrones, runaways, right? These categories appear in administrative documents preserved in the Archivo General de Indias. Important point about the term Negro. The Spanish colonial administration, Negro was primarily a legal social classification. It often referred to enslaved people or people assigned to the black caste category. Caste, but the documents themselves usually do not record birthplace. Because of that, the word does not automatically provide proof of continental origin. The same individual could sometimes appear under different classifications and different records, okay? Just like I've shown a lot of the American Indians being reclassified, right? Historians studying colonial Latin America have documented cases where indigenous people, mixed heritage individuals, or marginalized Europeans were reclassified into different legal racial categories depending on circumstances. That phenomenon is sometimes discussed in scholarship on colonial racial caste systems and administrative reclassifications. Okay, we've shown these sources in many old videos. Maroon communities in the 1650s, after the English invasion of Jamaica, Spanish and English sources describe independent mountain communities called Cimarrones, okay? And the known leaders we've already discussed. The documents describe the military activity and alliances, but they do not record birthplace or ancestry, okay? Evidence we can state with certainty from surviving primary documentation, indigenous peoples were present in Spanish Jamaica. Europeans were present in the colony. People categorized as Negroes existed in colonial records. Runaway communities existed, right? Cimarrones. What cannot be proven, again, from the surviving documents, the record do not provide birthplace for the Maroon leaders, okay? Ship manifests, they don't have that. Those specific individuals to African ports, right? They can't link these people to African ports. Explicit statements identifying those leaders as African born. None of the primary sources say they're Africans. Careful historical conclusion. The available documentation shows that Spanish Jamaica contained multiple populations living under colonial classifications, all right? What is the motto of Jamaica? Out of many, one people, right? Out of many, one people. However, the exact origins of the Maroon leaders recorded in the 1650s are not specified in the surviving sources, and the colonial racial terms used in those records do not themselves prove geographic ancestry. So I was like, yeah, go ahead and examine actual Spanish letters written during the war in Jamaica and look at the exact words they used describing the Maroon. That's because they was asking me if they wanted me to do that, right? So again, it's going to go over literally the same sources we already went over. Okay, the term most often used, Cimarrones. Again, that doesn't mean African. That just means runaway or fast or wild or people living apart from colonial society. Remember, like I said earlier. So free people could be called Cimarrones. It did not specify ethnicity. Example, wording from the correspondence summarized by Wright. Los Cimarrones que viven en los montes. Translation, the runaways who live in the mountains. So the focus on their status and location, not their ancestry. And so again, it goes over Juan de Bolas and Juan de Serras, right? El Capitan, the captain, Juan de Bolas, with his Cimarrones, with his Cimarron, his runaways. Again, wording identifies leadership role, military activity, but not origin. description of their fighting role. Isasi's report emphasized how important these fighters were to Spanish resistance. Typical wording described them as gente de los montes, or people of the mountains, cimarrones, or runaways, gente que conoce la tierra, people who know the land. This is how they're describing the maroon people, guys, not as Africans. These descriptions highlight knowledge of terrain, guerrilla warfare tactics, independence from Spanish settlements. One letter describing their importance in a report discussing the struggle against the English, Isasi essentially states that the resistance depended heavily on these fighters, okay? We've gone over that already. When Juan de Bolas changed sides, what happened? All of a sudden, Isasi lost power, the Spanish lost, the Spanish Catholics lost power, and the English Protestants under Cromwell were able to secure Jamaica because he switched sides, okay? We got that earlier. Words the letters do not use. So when referencing these fighters, the surviving letters do not describe them using terms such as Africanos, okay? Or naturals of Guinea, or born in Africa, right? Those types of geographic identities appear in some Spanish colonial records elsewhere in the Americas, but they do not appear in the Jamaica war correspondence describing these fighters, okay? Body bag, period, body bag, that's it. You got zero evidence, zero proof, zero sources that say any of these maroons were from Africa. None of the primary sources describe them in those ways. What the letters actually reveal, from the wording of the Spanish documents themselves, the fighters are described as cimarrones, runaways, or independent people. So it's not just runaways, guys, free people who weren't down with the colony. Come on now. That sound like Indians to me. People of the mountains, huh? People of the mountains. Followers of a named leader such as Juan de Bolas. The document emphasized military activity, alliances, geography. They do not describe their ancestry or birthplace. Okay? So the strict source-based conclusion from the Spanish wartime letter is the fighters who resisted the English in Jamaica in the 1650s are described in the documents primarily as cimarrones, living in the mountains, under leaders like Juan de Bolas, without explicit statements about continental origin. Exactly. Right, so this is when I started talking about, now I'd like to remind you of a group of people who the Spanish were allowing to settle there, right, and have a haven, and that was the Sephardic Jews and Muslim Moors who were fleeing the Inquisition. So this is, again, all happening in the 150 years before the English came, before Juan de Bolas, switched sides and allowed the English to win. I'm trying to remind it about the Sephardic crypto Jews and the Spanish town, right? Remember, that was given to them. It's going to argue with me saying, no, these were Spanish, not all of them were Sephardic, some of them were. It's wrong to say this was a Sephardic settlement, but we literally just read the book the other day, right? In this video, how Jamaica became a crypto Jewish trading hub, right? Today's review of chapter in the book Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean, and how we broke it down, right? But the ChatGPT is missing all this. And I also mentioned about the convicts and prisoners of war and slaves and undersiders from Ireland's colony in England. So of course it's going to say, well, that happened after. That's not the same. Okay, we'll give them that. So you bring up real historical currents in the Caribbean, right? Sephardic Jews in the Caribbean, right? After the Spanish Inquisition, many Sephardic Jews and Iberians eventually settled in the parts of the Caribbean, especially after the expulsion of Jews from Spain. Many lived outwardly as Christians, called conversos or crypto Jews, while secretly practicing Judaism. These communities became active in trade and commerce across the Atlantic world. Jews in Jamaica specifically, that Jewish settlement in Jamaica is strongly documented after the English took the island in 1655. When the English conquered the island during the English invasion of Jamaica, Jews from Spanish and Portuguese territories were allowed to settle openly. Why? Because the English were Protestants. Cromwell was cool with the cryptos. He was a crypto, right? Like these people were like secretly, their ancestry were cryptos. A major port where they became active merchants was Port Royal, right? Where all the pirates were, right? Merchants, huh? Pirates. Historians documenting Jewish life there includes Edward Chrysler, author of Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. These communities included merchants, traders, ship owners, and sometimes privateers. So Spanish Town, right? Originally called Villa de la Vega. So in the book Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean by Edward Chrysler, he literally gave specific names of the founders of this place and who they were and why they founded there. Because Charles V allowed the Sephardic Jews to have a little haven there so he can run the business for them, right? So founded by the Spanish in the early 1500s, it was a Spanish colonial administrative town after the English conquest, continued to develop and later included Jewish residents. But the town itself was not originally founded as a Sephardic settlement. That's what I debunked. I told them, hey, I know this already, right? We read it already. You're also correct that early Atlantic colonies included many groups arriving under difficult conditions. These included indentured servants, prisoners of war, transported convicts, religious refugees, forced laborers. For example, during the English colonial period, many Irish and Scottish prisoners were transported to the Caribbean colonies. But again, large-scale British transportation of these groups to Jamaica mostly occurred after the English conquest, okay? So not during the Spanish period. So could such people join runaway communities? In general, yes. All right? Yes, Europeans were some of the Cimarrones guys. Across the Americas, runaway communities sometimes included people from different backgrounds because they were defined by escape from colonial authority, not ethnicity, okay? But identifying specific individuals in Jamaica's 1650s maroon communities remains difficult because of surviving documents rarely list detailed personal backgrounds. So revised evidence-based conclusion based on the primary documentation for Jamaica before 1655, the island's population under Spanish rule included indigenous people, Spanish settlers, and other Europeans, people categorized in colonial records as Negroes, and so on, right? We got all this. So the early records clearly show that Jamaica's early population and its runaway communities existed within a complex Atlantic world of mixed peoples, migrations, and shifting legal categories. But the surviving documents from the 1650s do not record the precise ancestry or birthplace of the Maroon leaders themselves. Period. Period. Okay? So I said, hey, you say the Spanish town was not this, but I told them, hey, man, I know the founder. I know the lady that Charles V sold it, who was Columbus, Diego's, Columbus, his son Diego Colon wife, right? We read that in the book, literally read that. We had her name and everything, right? So it's gonna argue with me about that a little bit. It says Sephardic presence in the Caribbean, yeah, after the expulsion of the persecutions tied to the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews. These converso crypto Jews participated heavily in Atlantic commerce, maritime trade, colonial settlement. Because open Judaism was illegal in Spanish territory, many lived publicly as Christians, all right? Arguments made by historians about crypto Jews. Some historians argue that converso families were present in early Caribbean colonies, including Jamaica. One modern historian whose project is Edward Chrysler. So in his book, right, that we read, Jewish Parts of the Caribbean, he describes how converso merchants were involved in trade networks, smuggling, privateering, colonial commercial, right? So beyond the book, Jewish Parts of the Caribbean, we've already proven that. We didn't need his book. His book is just very cool because it talks about pirates specifically, right? Why the historical record is difficult, you're correct about one key thing. If someone was secretly Jewish during the Inquisition era, official documents would rarely label them as Jewish because that identity had to remain hidden, you see? So this is what I was saying. How do you know the people in Spanish Town weren't Sephardic Jews? The book literally is going individual case by case and showing that they were. I explained to him. And of course, they're going to hide that in Catholic records that these are Jews. They're not supposed to be there. They're not supposed to be Jews. That is illegal at the time. So that's what it's saying right here. Instead, they appear in records as Christians or Spaniards or Portuguese settlers or merchants. Who's the merchants? I told you guys. So modern historians sometimes use genealogy, surnames, trade networks, and family origins to reconstruct possible Sephardic ancestry. And they do it very scholarly and they're able to prove it. But that method produces interpretation, but it's the records fit. It's not like the African false records that don't exist. With the Columbus connection you mentioned, Diego's wife was Maria de Toledo. Her family belonged to a powerful Alvarez de Toledo noble lineage. Some writers have speculated about converso ancestry among certain Iberian elites. Okay, she was a Sephardic Jew, and she was helping her people, right? The broader Atlantic context, the broader point that early Caribbean society involved many hidden identities and persecuted groups is historically recognized, okay? It's not just Africans, all these so-called slaves and runaways, guys, that people living outside of society in the mountains. They're not just Africans, okay? The early Atlantic world included conversos, crypto Jews, Moriscos, Muslims forced to convert, transported prisoners, indentured servants, enslaved people, colonial soldiers, refugees from religious persecution. That create extremely complex social mixtures in many colonies. This is your true ancestry, guys. Now, all that with the American Indians who also fall in enslaved people, transported prisoners, right? Even colonial soldiers, Indians helped out refugees, right? Number 7, where historians generally agree, scholars broadly agree that Sephardic merchant networks were active across the Caribbean. Many conversions participated in Atlantic trade and settlement. Jewish communities became prominent in Jamaica after the English conquest, especially after the English conquest. Why? Because you got to understand who the English were, these Protestants, these conversos, right? Where historians differ how large the crypto Jewish presence was. That's the what part that's hidden. That's the part we've uncovered on my channel. It was massive. The careful historical position, your argument that some early settlers may have had Sephardic or Morisco backgrounds is plausible within the Atlantic context, especially given hidden identities during the Inquisition. But proving a majority Sephardic population Spanish town before it requires genealogical documentation for settlers themselves. And that's what these authors did. They did that. That's what the ChatGPT don't understand. Okay. So I said, okay, apart from everything, right? Let's get to the point, guys. Basically, bottom line, no proof that Juan de Bolas was African, right? Short answer, yes. That's the honest bottom line based on the surviving records, okay? Period. There is no known primary source that proves that Juan de Bolas was born in Africa, descended from mainland Africans, or transported to Jamaica on a slave ship from Africa, right? Or even on a slave ship. He could be local. He could be local. What the actual documents say, the Spanish wartime letters from 1650s written by Cristobal Arnoldo Isasi describe him simply as a leader of cimarron runaways operating in the mountains of Jamaica. The term used in the Spanish letters is cimarrones, meaning runaways. People living outside colonial control. So not just runaways, but people living outside colonial control, free people, independent, sovereign people, outside of colonial control, sovereign people, right? And Indians, doesn't that describe Indians? Those letters do not describe his ancestry or birthplace. What the records do not say. No surviving documents from the 1600s says that Juan de Bolas was Africano. All right, nothing in Spanish says Africano, man. Nada dice que él era africano, man. Tienen que dejar de mentir porque no hay evidencia que él era africano. I'm saying you guys got to stop lying, because there is no evidence or proof or records that say that he was African, or even natural de Guinea, or natural of Guinea, right? Or that he was born or nacido in Africa or born in Africa, right? None of the records say that. Those kinds of geographic identifiers do not appear in some colonial records elsewhere, but they do not appear for him. What modern historians did, later historians, right? Modern historians, Pan-African, Afrocentric, gatekeepers, right, as well. Not just, I'm saying the Pan-Africans are gatekeepers, they do it willingly because that's what they believe, right? But I'm saying there's actual gatekeepers too. Later historians often assume he was African or descended from Africans because he led a Maroon community. Maroons later became associated with African descended populations, but that is interpretive, not direct documentary proof, okay? Evidence-based conclusion from the surviving primary sources, Juan de Bolas was a Maroon or Cimarron leader in Jamaica during 1655-1660 war. The documents do not state his origin or ancestry, so it cannot be proven that he was African, and the records leave his background unknown. So we got to stop making things up. So I said, okay, make me a thumbnail now. And this is the thumbnail gave me, right? Make me a thumbnail now. And that's the thumbnail gave me, right? So bottom line, guys, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you see, because remember, we talked about Yanga from Mexico, right? Another Maroon leader. And also the same story. There's no proof that he's African. Same story. Same story. Same thing. Same exact stories. All right. I showed you American Indians are being enslaved. Today, I even showed you, in one example, 40,000 Lucayans alone. And I showed you 4,000 Indians being brought to Hispaniola by the orders of Charles V, which matches the order that he had of 4,000 Negroes being enslaved and sent to Spanish colonies. That was the license. That was the limit. What a coincidence that it matches, right? 4,000, huh? When we know we got a record of Charles V enslaving 4,000 Indians, right? Same ones he's probably calling 4,000 Negroes. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. As you guys can see, there's no proof of this guy being from Africa at all. Juan de Bolas, the leader of the Jamaican Maroons, who helped the English take over Jamaica, who was helping the Spanish before that. All right? Anything else added is inference, is modern day hijacks. It has been debunked. If you watch this video completely, there's no way you can say this guy is from Africa. And I showed you all the sources, and I showed you other things. And you can catch up on all the previous presentations the last 8 to 9 years for the whole drop. All right, for all the research. Again, thank you for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it, guys. Thank you for the people who was here in the live chat. Anybody who donated as well. Thank you for that, guys. Really appreciate it. I'll give you your Tuesday afternoon back. Thank you for coming through. I got way more videos I've been working on. This was the last minute thing I did. I was actually working on other videos all these days that I'm getting ready for you guys. You're very welcome. Thank you. I appreciate you guys who came through the live chat. Thank you for being here in the live chat. And anybody that came later on. Appreciate you guys. We're going to go out with a song called Mass Appeal, because I hope this has a mass appeal, and I hope that you guys help me spread this. Help me like the video, subscribe to the channel, share the video. Juan de Bolas, man. Most likely either Indian or a Black European. I'm going with Indian mostly. But I think he has might have some Spanish, some Sephardic in him or something. Maybe. Yeah. Appreciate you guys. Shout out to Science for the intro beat and the outro beat. Mass appeal. Thank you guys for, again, coming through. Pura vida, mi gente. Pura vida. Much love and respect. All right. Wow. Hawa.